We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides.
The latest consumer price index numbers for August came in, and President Biden holds a party in celebration. From songs by crooner James Taylor to talking up his massive government spending agenda, the president appears to be totally out of touch with economic reality. Well, what is the real situation in American finance? There is no one better suited to answer that particular tricky question than Liberty Nation's economics guru, Mr. Andrew Moran. Andrew, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. I think Mark Angelides would be better suited than my position.
I shouldn't think so. I can barely count plus 2 = 5. No, Andrew, even as Joe Biden was taking his victory lap, his very public victory lap, the stock markets, they began tumbling. And we actually saw that when it was going live. You had the chyron of the stock markets just ticking down and down. It was really quite an epic sight to be seen. But surely this 8.3% inflation digit, it was expected, wasn't it?
Well, not really, because you look at the financial markets the day before the reading came in, it was actually the Dow Jones, the S&P, and the NASDAQ were rallying on the news. The whole expectation that everyone had was that the market consensus was 8.1%, but there was a lot of expectation of be below that just because the crash in energy prices. Now, when it comes to the entrenchment of inflation, this is here to stay. Liberty Nation warned about this after the July inflation report came out, saying, the CPI number came down to 8.5% from 9.1%. However, you're starting to see that inflation is across the board, which I've been regularly reporting on how all the durable goods were rising in prices. Now you're seeing a shift to the service side of the inflation, which is now, this could be a major problem moving forward. And I think that, the conversation moving forward in the financial markets at the very least is that it's not so much as going to be peak inflation. The concern is how slow inflation will come down over the next 12 months as the Fed raises rates. And, and then also moving forward, the core inflation rate, that's also going to be a major metric that a lot of investors are going to focus on. The core is, it eliminates the volatile food and energy prices. So you already have high food prices.
That's an interesting factor, Andrew. So many people have talked about that you say, and they highlight that, core inflation, that's not the same as the regular inflation because, we take out the things that make it look worse.
Yes.
But surely if you just take out the things that make it look worse for your designated political party, then really, you're doing a disservice to both the economy, the financial markets, the consumers, the people who are essentially trying to get by paycheck to paycheck, because you're painting a false picture. And by painting that falsity, aren't you essentially extending the period of horror, financial horror?
Well, that's why you have different metrics of inflation. That's why you have the regular CPI. That's why you have the core CPI. You have the PPI. You have the basic price index. Overall, it just everything gives you a greater sense of what's happening in the broader economy. If you're just focusing on the CPI, then that's a problem in itself. And also the other problem too, if you want to talk about metrics, is that the way the government calculates everything. The CPI doesn't include housing, which it should. The people who put together CPI, they regularly change the way things are weighted. So that's also an issue. And, if you just look at the way CPI was calculated even before the 1980s, this CPI would be a lot higher than 8.3%. At the very least, be at 10%. If you look at the shadow stats by John Williams, economist John Williams, it's, 15%. So,
does John Williams include housing?
I'm sorry?
Does John Williams include housing in his metrics?
Yeah. He does include housing because that's the way the government would calculate inflation back in the day. They just started to remove these things because their idea behind excluding housing was that housing is an investment, so you shouldn't factor that into your CPI calculations, which of course is asinine. That should include it because you need a house, you need a roof over your head.
Well, not if you live in California, apparently. Now, what were some of the big surprises from this latest August CPI report?
Well, I can't really calculate if you consider them surprises. I think a lot. Food.
Let's call them shocks.
Well, fine. Let's use that word. The food price index, that's surged, more than 12%. If you look at the food at home within that index, which calculates grocery store prices, that was up nearly 14%. The shelter costs, which is the price of rent, that was up 6.2%. So you see these dramatic increases on things that people need, which is a huge factor of why people should be worried about this entrenchment of inflation, because that's going to, let's use shelter as an example. If you're paying more to rent your home, that's going to lead to broader consequences, because that's going to eat more of your budget. That's going to eat more of your wages. That's going to lead to waning demand for everything else in the economy. That's 2/3 consumption. So that's a major concern. Also, if you want to talk about shelter as well, Cleveland Fed Bank President Loretta Mester, she made a warning saying that I'm concerned that peak inflation isn't here yet because of how high shelter costs are. So if shelter costs are higher and that's going to lead to greater inflation, what does that mean? Well, you guess it. It's going to mean higher interest rates, higher for longer interest rates, which then, it's going to trigger that sharp economic downturn that everyone is really worried about, that the Fed is not going to achieve the soft landing. It's going to be a hard crash. And so far, if you look at a lot of the economic metrics, except for the consumer sentiment indexes for whatever reason, you should be worried, and sharp economic is going to come. Yeah, you're in the middle of a recession right now, but the pain is more to come.
In the middle of a recession,
Jerome
Andrew,
Powell said in his speech,
surely that makes you an extremist, Andrew. Now, you mentioned earlier about inflation being entrenched in the U.S. economy. Now, I'm not an economist, and I don't pretend to understand all of the interplays here, so you may have to explain this to me. But does it mean that although there may be mild fluctuations, 8.3 to 8.5, for example, in the month-to-month numbers, inflation is basically here to stay for the foreseeable future? Is that what that means by entrenched?
Yes, that is correct. And I don't know why the likes of CNBC and Market Watch are just using the word entrenched now, because Labor Nation is reporting about this for months. If you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics CPI report, and you look at the detailed expenditure category, everything has been up across the board for months. This isn't just in the July or August CPI data. But the thing that you have to be worried about, as I alluded to earlier, is this transition from goods inflation to the services inflation. Because aside from, let's say, women's dresses and men's suits, which actually fell, everything has been up. And I'll tell you why.
Both of those are good for us, Andrew.
I'll tell you why men's suits and women's dresses are up. That's only because, as Labor Nation reported again, is that the retailers have had bloated inventories. They need to dump their stock, so they've been slashing prices. But also, again, as I mentioned earlier, you're seeing the transition from goods inflation to services inflation. So you see dental care services rising, pet services have been up, physician services are up. So you're having that consumer shift again from, at the beginning of pandemic, everyone bought goods. Now you're on the other side of the pandemic, everyone's buying services again. So yeah, that's the entrenchment that you should be concerned about.
Very briefly, Andrew, I'm not entirely sure why the service sector inflation would be up, particularly, for example, physicians, dental services, things like this. What's driving that?
Well, demand, of course. So you have consumer demand, demanding for services. You don't have enough labor covering that services, so a lot of these companies have to hire more workers. Products to fulfill these services are also up. So that's overall why the services indexes, whether you're looking at the CPI or the PPI, are up.
Okay,
and that's probably the most succinct explanation I can give you.
I appreciate it. So does this mean that for the foreseeable future, the administration will have to keep defending its spending policies as voters head towards the midterm polls?
Well, you saw that Joe Biden statement that he gave after the inflation report saying, the administration's making progress on global inflation, even though the numbers were worse than expected. His policies have not done anything at all. He's taking credit now that gasoline has fallen $1.40 from its peak of $5.02, but that was only because of collapsing consumer demand, or demand destruction, if you want to use the correct economics term. China's lockdowns, recession fears. So on the energy side, everything has fallen in spite of his policies. And then, of course, in the coming months, he's going to tout the Inflation Reduction Act. But by the time that thing seeps into the economy, you better hope that inflation has been reined in by the Federal Reserve. But then by the time that happens, you have the sharp recession that's going to trigger this whole house of cards to crumble. And then, of course, what's funny, what is funny about Joe Biden and the policymakers of the Federal Reserve is that they've just been spending months trying to rein in inflation, but everything they've done hasn't done anything at all. On the Fed side of the thing is that the Federal Reserve has been raising interest rates every single month since March. They haven't done anything about it at all because they're not raising rates as much as they should. They need to raise rates a lot higher than the inflation rate. So you have the Fed funds rate at 3%, inflation at 8%. You need to bring the Fed funds rate to above 8% to have anything at all. They need to pull a Paul Volcker, which is not going to do because now that would initiate the financial crisis that the United States will not be able to endure.
Well, Joe Biden promised us a dark winter, and it looks like that's going to be a promise kept. Andrew Moran, thank you ever so much.
Thank you for having me.
We'll be right back after this short break, talking Liberty with Scott DeCosenza on American lawlessness. Don't go anywhere. We dismiss history at our peril.
Liberty Nation Radio with Mark Angelides. Entertaining, informative, and just plain fun. Watch Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5. Produced by conservatives for conservatives. C5's The Left Free Zone. Hosted by Liberty Nation's Lisa K. Donner. Joined by a raucous, irreverent panel of authors. Deconstructing leftist narratives. Debating the hot topics. And remembering to laugh. Join the official conservative safe space.
You only did that to piss Jeff off.
Liberty Nation's The Conservative 5.